In the high, unforgiving country of Montana, the land does not merely surround a man, it judges him. It is a vast, indifferent cathedral of stone and wind, where the sky is so impossibly wide, it feels like it might crush a soul under the weight of its own blue infinity. For Silas Thorne, this landscape was the only mirror he had looked into. For 10 long, grueling years, he was a man of 35 who carried the silence of a century in the marrow of his bones. To the few travelers who dared pass through the desolate outpost of Bitter Creek, he was nothing more than a silhouette against the horizon. A grim, unyielding figure, carved from the same jagged granite as the mountains that loomed over his ranch, like ancient, watchful gods. Silas stood on the station platform on this blistering July afternoon, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the warped floorboards. The heat was a living thing, a shimmering veil that made the air feel thick enough to chew. He breathed in, but the air offered no relief. It was heavy with the scent of sun-scorched pine dry earth and the faint metallic tang of the railroad tracks. He adjusted his Stetson, the brim casting a deep shadow over eyes that had forgotten how to look for beauty. They were eyes the color of a winter storm, trained only to look for signs of rain, the movement of stray cattle, or the encroaching shadows of predators. In his vest pocket, he felt the weight of that letter. It wasn't physically heavy, but to Silas, it felt like a lead ingot, pressing against his ribs, a constant reminder of a decision made in a moment of rare, terrifying weakness. He didn't need to pull it out to remember the words. He had written them himself 6 months ago, during a winter so brutal it was known as the Great Die-Up. He remembered sitting by the hearth of his small 2-room cabin, watching the frost creep across the window panes in patterns that looked like skeletal fingers. The silence that night hadn't been peaceful. It had been predatory. It had whispered to him that if he died in his sleep, the snow would bury his house, and the world would go on without ever knowing a man named Silas Thorne had ever existed. In that fit of desperation, he had reached out to the east. He wasn't looking for a soulmate. Love was a fiction sold in cheap dime novels to people who had never seen a horse go lame or a well run dry. He was looking for a partner, a pair of hands to knead the bread, and a heartbeat to drown out the madness of the silence. "I am a man of hard habits and a harder life," he had written. "I can offer a name and a roof. If you are looking for poetry, stay where you are. If you are looking to survive, write back." He had been brutally honest, almost hoping no one would answer. But a reply had come from a woman named Clara. Now, as the distant rhythmic thrumming of the locomotive began to vibrate through the soles of his boots, Silas felt a wave of regret so cold it surpassed even the memory of that winter. He looked out at the jagged coulees and the endless sea of brown grass that could be ignited by a single spark. This was no place for a woman. This was a place that broke people, turning their hearts to flint and their skin to leather. What had he been thinking? He was a creature of the wilderness, as solitary as a mountain lion. The thought of a stranger in his house, the scent of lavender invading his dusty timber rooms, and the inevitable questions she would ask, made his stomach turn. He wanted to mount his horse and ride into the high timber until the train was long gone, and the station was once again reclaimed by the dust. But the train was already here. The locomotive appeared as a black titan against the amber sky, belching a column of thick, oily soot. It was a screaming, hissing monster of steam and steel. As it roared into the station, the brakes shrieked like 1,000 dying birds, and the very air seemed to vibrate with the power of it. A cloud of white steam erupted from the engine, enveloping the platform in a blinding fog. Silas stood his ground, his hat pulled low, his jaw set in a hard line. He felt like an executioner waiting for a ghost. Then through the thinning mist, he saw her. She was standing on the bottom step of the passenger car, clutching the iron railing as if she were afraid the wind might carry her away. She was small, dangerously small. She wore a dress of faded periwinkle blue, a color that looked utterly absurd against the harsh ochre landscape. Her face was pale, her skin stretched tight over delicate cheekbones, and her eyes were large and dark, reflecting a terror so profound it made Silas's own heart skip a beat. She looked like a creature made of glass and lace, dropped into a world of iron and rock. She was a mistake, a beautiful, tragic mistake that Silas had invited into his life with a few strokes of a pen. The regret wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a landslide. He saw her hands tremble as she clutched her small wooden trunk. He saw her look at the vast horizon, her eyes widening, as she realized that there was nowhere to hide, no trees to shield her, no buildings to break the wind. He didn't move to help her. He didn't offer a hand or a word of welcome. He simply stood there, a grim sentinel of the plains, watching as she took her first trembling step onto the earth that he knew with a sickening certainty would surely break her. The road to the Thorn Ranch was not a road at all, but a series of jagged scars carved into the earth by those stubborn enough to stay. As the town of Bitter Creek vanished into a haze of dust behind them, the silence between Silas and Clara became a third passenger heavy cold and suffocating. Silas didn't look at her. He didn't have to. He could feel her presence like a splinter under his skin, a constant reminder of the gamble he had taken in a moment of winter madness. He focused his eyes on the twitching ears of his horses, his mind drifting to the relentless list of chores that awaited him. He thought of the fence line that needed mending near the creek, and the hay that needed cutting before the scorching July heat turned it to tinder. To Silas, people were like the weather, unpredictable, fickle, and often destructive. But the land was honest. If you worked it until your back broke, it fed you. If you neglected it, it reclaimed you. He was a man carved from the very granite that made his ranch so difficult to plow. At 35, Silas Thorne's face was a landscape of its own, etched with the deep lines of a decade spent battling the elements. A thin, jagged scar ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jawline, a jagged souvenir from a winter cattle drive years ago when a frozen branch had nearly claimed his sight in a midnight blizzard. His shoulders were broad, hunched slightly forward, as if he were perpetually bracing for a gust of wind that never stopped blowing. His movements were economical, stripped of all unnecessary grace. He was a machine of survival. He had learned early on that in the West, emotion was a luxury that led to mistakes, and mistakes led to the grave. He had watched his father die with his boots on and his heart empty, and Silas had long ago accepted that his own path would likely be the same. He had invited Clara here to be a tool, a cog, in the machinery of his survival. But seeing her now so small and fragile against the immense, terrifying horizon, he felt a bitter surge of resentment. He had sent for a partner, and he feared he had received a burden. Clara, however, was not the porcelain doll Silas imagined her to be. Beneath the faded periwinkle blue of her dress and the layer of station dust, there was a spine made of tempered steel. She watched the mountains with a terrifying intensity, her dark eyes reflecting the jagged snow-capped peaks as if she were trying to memorize their shapes. She was escaping a life that had been slowly suffocating her in the cramped, soot-stained tenements of New York. She remembered the relentless, deafening roar of the textile mills, the way the white lint filled her lungs until every breath was a desperate struggle, and the way the sun was nothing more than a gray smudge beyond the factory windows. To her, this terrifying Montana vastness was not a threat. It was a sanctuary. For the first time in 20 years, she could breathe without tasting coal smoke. She stole a glance at Silas out of the corner of her eye. She saw the hardness in his profile, the way his jaw remained clenched, as if he were chewing on gravel. She saw his hands toil-worn, stained with saddle grease, and grit hands that knew only violence and labor. She knew he regretted her arrival. She could feel his disappointment radiating off him like the heat from the sun-baked earth. But Clara was no stranger to being unwanted. She had spent a lifetime being told she wasn't enough, and she had survived anyway. She carried a secret in the way she clutched her wooden trunk, a secret that weighed more than the few clothes and the old Bible inside. She hadn't come to Montana for a husband. She had come for the distance. Distance from the ghosts of her sisters who hadn't made it out of the sweatshops, and distance from a past that still nipped at her heels like a starving wolf. The sun began to dip lower, casting long, bruised shadows of purple and gold across the trail. The wind picked up, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine and the promise of a cold night. Silas shifted his weight, the old leather of his vest creaking in the absolute stillness. He wanted to say something to tell her that the house was drafty, or that the wolves would howl near the porch at night. He wanted to apologize for the coldness of his welcome, but the words were trapped behind years of disuse, choked by a pride that refused to break. He was a man who had forgotten the shape of kindness, and she was a woman who had learned to distrust it. And so they rode on in a symphony of creaking wood and thudding hooves. Two broken people moving toward a house that was not yet a home, under a sky that didn't care if they lived or died. In the weeks that followed, the Thorne Ranch settled into a heavy, unhurried rhythm, a symphony of friction and labor that spoke louder than any words ever could. Life in Bitter Creek was not measured by the calendar, but by the chores that sunrise demanded and sunset left unfinished. For Silas, the presence of a woman in his house was like a new harness on an old horse. It felt stiff, awkward, and carried a weight he wasn't yet used to. He kept to the shadows of the barn and the far reaches of the north pasture, pushing himself and his livestock until his muscles screamed for reprieve. He was trying to outrun the sudden, unsettling domesticity of his own home. He didn't know how to act around the soft rustle of Clara's skirt, or the way the cabin now smelled of lye soap and toasted sourdough instead of just dust and stale tobacco. Every morning, before the sun had even managed to pierce the gray veil of the horizon, Silas would find a cup of coffee waiting for him on the porch rail. It was black bitter and hot enough to scald exactly how he liked it. He never saw her place it there, and he never thanked her for it. To Silas, acknowledging the gesture felt like a surrender, a crack in the fortress of his solitude. He would drink it in silence, watching the light slowly bleed into the valley before heading out to mend the miles of barbed wire fence that the winter had ravaged. It was lonely, soul-crushing work, but it was the only thing that made sense to him. The land was a debt he owed to his ancestors, and he paid it every day in sweat and grit. Clara, meanwhile, was fighting a private war of her own within the four walls of the cabin. The transition from the cramped tenements of New York to the vast isolation of Montana was a shock to her system that no letter could have prepared her for. The wood stove was a temperamental beast that required constant coaxing, and the water had to be hauled in heavy wooden buckets from a well that felt a mile away. Her hands, once soft from years of handling silk and lace, were now blistered and raw. She spent her days scrubbing heavy wool blankets until her knuckles bled, and learning to cook meals out of nothing but dried beans, salt pork, and determination. There were moments in the heat of the afternoon when the wind died down and the silence became deafening, when she wanted to scream. She wanted to pack her small trunk and walk until she hit the railroad tracks. But then, she would look out the window and see Silas. A lone, stubborn figure silhouetted against the immense sky, and she would find a hidden reservoir of strength she didn't know she possessed. The connection between them grew in the spaces between actions. It was in the way Silas began to leave the heavy water buckets half filled so they would be easier for her to carry. It was in the way Clara noticed the fraying hem of his work coat and stayed up past midnight to mend it with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. They ate their meals in a silence so thick it was almost tangible. The only sound the scraping of forks against tin plates. Silas would watch her out of the corner of his eye, noticing the way she tilted her head when she was tired, or the way she touched the small wooden trunk as if it were an altar. He saw the bruises on her arms from the heavy labor and felt a twinge of something that felt dangerously like guilt. One evening, after a particularly brutal day in the sun, Silas returned to find a small tin of salve sitting on the washstand next to a basin of fresh, cool water. There was no note, but the scent of lavender and beeswax filled the room. He looked at his cracked, bleeding palms, then at the closed door of the bedroom where Clara was already resting. He didn't use the salve that night, but he didn't throw it away either. He tucked it into his pocket, a small weight that felt like a bridge being built over an impossible canyon. They were two strangers, bound by a contract. Yet in the quiet grind of their daily lives, the shadows of the past were slowly being replaced by the reality of the person sitting across the table. They were learning a new language, a language of presence, of shared burden, and of a quiet, stubborn endurance that the West demanded of all its children. Peace in the Montana Territory was never a permanent gift. It was a borrowed thing, a fragile truce between the land and the men who tried to tame it, and the interest was always paid in either blood or soil. Just as the jagged edges of suspicion between Silas and Clara had begun to soften under the weight of shared labor, the world outside decided to remind them that Bitter Creek was a place of predators. The arrival of Elias Vance was not a sudden surprise, but it felt like a cold curse delivered on the back of a scorching wind. Vance was a man who saw the wilderness not as a home or a sanctuary, but as a carcass to be picked clean by those with enough gold and enough ruthlessness. He had spent the last 5 years buying up the surrounding acreage, slowly strangling the smaller ranches by cutting off their access to the lifeblood of the high plains. The water. Silas's ranch sat on the only reliable year-round creek for 20 miles, a geographical fact that Vance considered a personal insult to his vast ambitions. As the riders pulled their horses to a skidding halt in front of the porch, the air grew heavy and stagnant, thick with the scent of unwashed animals, cheap tobacco, and unspoken threats. Vance looked at Silas, not as a neighbor, but with the cold, calculating eyes of a man measuring a grave. He spoke in a voice that was deceptively smooth, talking of old debts of forged land deeds he had acquired, and of the inevitable crushing weight of progress that Silas was supposedly standing in the way of. But it wasn't just the land or the water that Vance seemed to hunger for today. He had a way of looking at the small timber cabin and the woman standing in its darkening shadow that made Silas's jaw tighten until the muscles ached with the strain. Vance had spent time in the corrupt, teeming cities of the East, and he carried the stench of those crowded, desperate streets with him, like a second skin. When his gaze finally settled on Clara, his smirk widened into something jagged, predatory, and deeply unsettling. "I heard the rumors through the grapevine, Thorn," Vance drawled, his voice grating like gravel at the bottom of a tin cup. "I heard you'd gone and found yourself a bride to keep the winter chill away. But a man in your position should be careful about what he picks up from the gutter. Sometimes you bring home a bird with a clipped wing, hoping to nurse it back to health, and other times you accidentally bring home a creature that's running from a cage it didn't quite manage to lock behind it. Some secrets have long legs, Silas. They can walk all the way from the New York tenements to the Montana foothills without breaking a sweat." The words hit Silas like a physical blow to the solar plexus, knocking the wind from his lungs. He didn't turn back to look at Clara, but he felt the sudden sharp intake of her breath behind him, a sound of pure unadulterated terror. The doubt he had spent weeks burying under piles of firewood and mended fences began to claw its way back to the surface of his mind. He looked at Clara's pale, stricken face, reflected in the window pane, and saw not just the exhaustion of a farm wife, but the haunting, paralyzing fear of a fugitive. Who was this woman he had invited into his bed and his home? Was she a partner in his survival, or was she a liability, a hidden fuse that Vance was more than happy to light? The fragile bridge of trust they had been building through silent morning coffees and shared burdens seemed to crumble into ash under the heat of Vance's knowing gaze. Vance left with a final, chilling promise that seemed to hang in the air long after the dust had settled. "The storm is coming, Silas. Not just the one brewing in the sky, but the one that levels everything a man thinks he owns. Make sure your house is in order, Thorn, or I'll be the one to burn it down and sow the ashes with salt." As the riders disappeared back into the haze, the silence that returned to the ranch was fundamentally different than the one that had existed an hour before. It was no longer the silence of peaceful labor or of shy mutual discovery. It was the suffocating silence of a house divided by a secret. Silas turned to look at Clara, his eyes turning hard and flinty once more, searching her face for the shadow of the lie he was now certain was hiding there. The sky above them turned a bruised, sickly purple, the air growing unnaturally still and heavy, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. The external pressure had finally found the crack in their foundation, and as the first low, ominous rumble of thunder rolled across the mountain peaks, Silas felt the old bitter regret returning colder and sharper than the winter that had first driven him to write that fateful letter to a stranger. The storm that hit Bitter Creek that night was not merely weather. It was a reckoning. It was as if the Montana sky had finally lost its patience with the two stubborn, isolated souls living beneath it, and had decided to wash away their pride with a deluge of ice and wind. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew thick with the smell of ozone, wet earth, and impending disaster. Silas, driven by a lifetime of hard instinct, had been outside for hours, fighting a losing battle to keep his world from being torn apart. He was a man who believed he could out-wrestle nature itself. A hard man, built for a hard land, but as the wind shrieked with the voice of 1,000 banshees, he realized how terrifyingly small he truly was. When the barn beam gave way, it didn't just break his leg. It broke his illusion of invincibility. It was a physical manifestation of his life collapsing under the weight of his own stubborn choices. Lying in the freezing mud, the crushing weight of the timber beam forcing the air from his lungs, Silas felt the cold, indifferent hand of death reaching for him. It was a familiar feeling, one he had welcomed in his darkest moments of winter madness. But now, with a house that finally smelled like something other than stale tobacco and dust, he found with a jolt of terror that he wasn't ready to let go. He cried out, his voice swallowed by the thunder, but then, through the blinding curtain of rain, he saw a ghost in periwinkle blue. Clara didn't look fragile anymore. She moved with a desperate primal strength, her hair plastered to her face by the icy deluge, her dark eyes burning with a fire that the wind couldn't extinguish. Using a broken fence post as a lever, and pouring every ounce of her will into the effort, she managed to shift the crushing weight just enough for Silas to drag himself free, leaving behind a trail of blood in the mud. The struggle back to the cabin was a blur of excruciating pain and freezing water. Inside, the immense, terrifying world was reduced to the small circle of orange light from the fireplace. Clara worked with a frantic, focused energy, cutting away Silas's blood-soaked trousers and tending to the jagged wound on his leg. Her hands, once soft and now scarred by weeks of harsh labor, were steady. Silas watched her through a haze of agony, seeing the way she moved no longer a stranger or a burden, but a guardian. The suffocating silence between them was finally shattered, not by the anger Vance had tried to sow, but by the raw, bleeding truth of their situation. "Why?" Silas managed to rasp, his voice breaking as she pressed a hot, soothing cloth to his damaged skin. "Why didn't you just stay inside? You could have let the storm take me. You could have taken the gold in the lockbox and gone back east. You'd be free of this place and of me." Clara stopped, her hands hovering over his wound. She looked at him, and for the first time Silas saw the full weight of her history in her eyes. "Because I've spent my whole life watching things break, Silas. My sisters, my parents, my own heart. I didn't come to Montana to watch another good man be buried by the world because he was too stubborn to ask for help. I came here to build something that would last. Even if you don't want me, even if you never look at me as anything other than a liability, I've decided that I want this life. I want this land, and I won't let it take you." In that moment, the hardness in Silas's chest, the flint that had protected him from the world for a decade, finally shattered. He didn't have any poetic words. He didn't know how to speak them. He simply reached out his large, calloused hand, trembling violently as he covered hers. He didn't say he loved her, but he held her hand with a grip that said he would never let go. The secret she had carried in her trunk, the fear Vance had tried to weaponize, it didn't matter anymore. They were two broken people huddling together against a world that wanted to break them further. And for the first time since the train arrived, Silas Thorne didn't feel a single ounce of regret. As the storm continued to howl outside, the cabin became a fortress, and the man who had invited a stranger into his house realized that he had accidentally invited in his salvation. The morning after a great storm in Montana always feels like the first day of creation. The world is scrubbed clean, the dust settled by the rain, and the air carries a crispness that makes every breath feel like a gift. As the sun crawled over the jagged peaks of the Rockies, painting the valley in hues of honey and amber, the Thorne Ranch didn't look like a place of ruin. It looked like a place that had been tested and found worthy of standing. Silas sat on the porch, the pain in his leg a dull, manageable thrum, but the weight in his chest, the one he had carried for 10 years, was finally gone. He watched Clara as she moved about the yard, gathering the scattered tools and checking on the horses. She moved with a new sense of belonging, her footsteps no longer tentative, but firm and grounded in the earth that had nearly claimed them both. Elias Vance returned that morning as he had promised, but the man who rode onto the property was not the man who could win. He saw the way Silas looked at Clara, and the way Clara stood her ground, her hand never wavering as she handed Silas his rifle. There were no shots fired, No dramatic showdowns in the dirt. There didn't need to be. The West is a place that respects strength, and Vance saw a strength in the Thorn Ranch that no forged deed or cut-off creek could ever break. He saw two people who had looked into the abyss together and hadn't blinked. With a slow, lingering look at the water that still flowed through Silas's land, Vance turned his stallion around and rode back toward the town. He was a predator who knew when the prey had become the hunter. As the weeks turned into months, the Hoi Han that had once threatened to choke Silas Thorne became nothing more than a ghost of a memory. The cabin was no longer just a shelter from the wind. It was a home. It was filled with the sounds of life, the clatter of pans, the low murmur of conversation, and occasionally the rare rough sound of Silas's laughter. The mail-order bride he had regretted the moment she stepped off the train had become the very heartbeat of his existence. He realized that the land had not been enough to sustain him. He had needed a witness, someone to see the sun rise with, and someone to hold the lever when the world tried to crush him. Clara had not only saved his life, she had given him a reason to live it. They spent their evenings on the porch, watching the shadows of the mountains stretch across the plains. There was still hard work ahead, fences to be mended winters, to be survived, and the endless demanding cycle of the ranch. But they did it together. Silas would often look at the small wooden trunk Clara had brought with her, now tucked away in a corner of the bedroom, and marvel at how such a small thing could contain so much hope. He had asked for a worker, and he had received a queen. He had asked for survival, and he had found a soul. On the Thorn Ranch, the silence was no longer predatory. It was peaceful, a quiet promise of all the seasons yet to come. The West had tried to break them, but instead it had forged them into something unbreakable, a testament to the power of a storm to change a man's mind and a woman's destiny.